For this project, we're going to be recreating a Realisation par dress. I'm going to be using a linen, but you can use any fabric you like. For this video, we're going to need scissors, pins, thread, measuring tape, and fabric. I chose a medium weight linen. I started by mapping out the lines of my dress on my mannequin. The dress is made up of 2 pieces for the bust, 2 pieces on the back, and 2 side seams. I then placed my fabric on the mannequin and roughly cut around the lines I just created. I made sure to leave a 1 cm seam allowance along the lines. I then cut at the shoulder seam, again leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. As you can see, there's a lot of extra fabric that sticks out in the front, and we'll be turning that into darts. I created 4 darts and then cut away the extra fabric, again leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. And then I draped the back panel of the dress. Again, loosely cutting away the extra fabric and then cutting along the lines that I created, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. At the side seams, you want to make sure the 2 pieces line up. While you're cutting the side seams, you want to make sure that you have 1 cm seam allowance on the top, at the shoulder, and at the side. Now we're going to drape the front piece of the dress. Start by pinning it at the side and then loosely cutting away the extra fabric, following the lines on the mannequin. This piece should lie flat and should have no need for darts. Remember when cutting your fabric to leave 1 cm seam allowance on every edge. And when cutting your side seams, you can control the amount of volume that you'd like for your dress. Here's a better example of what I mean when draping the back piece. You can see I'm shifting the fabric around to change the difference in volume. Once I was happy with my volume, I placed my pins, and then cut along the lines, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. Using a measuring tape, I'm going to determine the length I'd like for this dress, and then I'm going to cut along the hem, leaving this time a 2 cm seam allowance. And then finally, I'm going to clean up the sides of the dress, cutting around my placed pins. Now with the draping all done, I'm going to cut out duplicates of the 2 top pieces. In total, I want to have 4 bust pieces and 4 back pieces. If you're using fabric that's one-sided, you want to make sure that half of your pieces are mirrored and cut on the other side. I'm now going to cut 2 strips that are going to be 4 cm by about 1/2 meter. These are going to be used as ties, so we're going to iron 1 cm up, and then the other side 1 cm up, and then we're going to fold it over. We're going to do this for both pieces, and then just with a straight stitch, we're going to sew that piece down. We're going to put those 2 ties aside for later. Now we're going to attach our side seams and our shoulder seams of our front and back pieces. We're going to start by sewing just 1 set of these, so then we can determine how we want to sew the other 2. We want to make sure when we're pinning our second set that our 2 wrong sides are facing together, so that both of the seam allowances are facing each other. Once you have that all pinned, you're ready to sew again your second set at the side seams and the shoulder seams. And now you're going to iron open all your seams. From what you just sewed, you should now have 4 pieces. We're now going to place them back on the mannequin, this time placing right sides together. And then you're going to pin along the neckline all the way to the back. And then you're going to sew along with a straight stitch where you just placed your pins. Now you're going to iron flat the seam that you just sewed, placing the seam allowance to one side. And now with that seam allowance pushed to the side, we're going to sew a top stitch through the 3 layers of fabric, making sure to sew as close to the edge as we can. We're going to fold over that seam and re-iron it. We should have now created quite a crisp edge. Placing the piece back on the mannequin, we're going to move on to the armhole, where we're going to fold over 1 cm to tuck in those 2 raw edges. And then we're going to continue that all the way around the armhole, pinning as we go. And then as close to the edge as we can, we're going to sew that with a straight stitch. Next, we're going to repin the pleats that we created while we were draping. We're going to do that for the 2 layers of fabric. And then we're going to sew those down to lock the pleats into place. Sewing very close to the edge so that you don't see this stitch when you're attaching your pieces back together. So now you've sewn your armhole, your neckline, and you've sewn down your pleats. You've made sure not to sew your pleats down together so that you can still reach the inside of this bodice piece. And now we want to do all the exact same steps for the other half. And the only step we have to mirror or do the opposite of is which direction to push the seam allowance in that first top stitch. We want to make sure that the seam allowance is facing away from the top piece of our garment. And then we're going to go again with the top stitch. Next step, we're going to pin, iron, and sew the armhole. And finally, we're going to pin down our pleats using the other half of the bodice as a guide. We want the two to be a mirror of each other, so continue using the other half to determine the placements of the pleats. We're then going to sew the pleats in place again with the stitch very close to the edge. We're now ready to sew our side seams. We're going to measure and place the ties in between the two layers of fabric, and then sew with a straight stitch. It's up to you where you place the ties. I decided to place mine a little below my rib cage. Because linen frays, we're going to trim away the extra fabric and then go over the seam again with a zigzag stitch. I make sure that the needle is going off the side of the fabric. You could also do this with a serger. Now flipping your fabric right side out, we're ready to attach the bodice pieces. I attached one of the bodice pieces already for placement, but your first step is actually going to be cutting a notch on that point between the two bodice pieces. And then you're going to pin your bodice piece right sides facing together onto the other piece of your pattern. And then again, cutting a notch, this time in the back. You're then going to sew around where you placed your pins, attaching your bodice piece to the main piece of the dress. This is what it should look like with your first bodice piece attached. And now you'll see the use of cutting the notch. So you're going to fold in your seam allowance 1 centimeter, tuck in the notch, and pin it from the other side. And you're going to do this all the way along your bodice piece, tucking in your seam allowance and pinning in so you're just catching your fabric on the other side. This is the reason for the 2 layers on the bodice, and is a professional looking technique to hide your seam allowance. You're now ready to pin on your second piece of the bodice, again placing right sides together. The more precise you are with your pinning, the less likely there will be a gap between your 2 bodice pieces. And you're now ready to sew where you placed your pins, attaching now the second piece of your bodice. You're then going to do the same fold over pinning technique that you did on the other side of your bodice. You're going to iron this all down flat, making sure that nothing's poking out, and sew along where you pinned. You're sewing right in between the seams so you can't actually see the stitch that you're creating. You're now going to move on to the hem, where you're going to fold your fabric over 1 centimeter, iron it, and then fold it over another centimeter. And then sew along with a straight stitch. The last step is optional, where I hand sewed on a flower embellishment on the front and between the 2 bodice pieces. And you're all done. Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please subscribe.